Hi everybody, it's Jalessa again, and this week we're going to do pave setting of 3 stones for a pendant. So let's get started. So we're going to start off talking about the tools that you need. First, you're going to need a ruler. You're also going to need some dividers. I have some 3mm stones, and then I have a piece of silver that's roughly 3.5mm wide, and you can see it's pretty long here because I'm going to be doing the demonstration and we'll cut off the excess when I'm done setting the stones. The first thing you want to do is mark and measure your piece of wire or your stock that you're using. And by the way, the thickness on this is 2mm because the height of my stone is 2mm. And what I'm going to do is first mark the center of my piece of metal. And the way I do that is I set my dividers to roughly the center, and I mark it in 2 ways. First, I mark in one direction, and then I turn the metal around and mark it in a second direction. That way I have a center line that's either right on the 2 lines that I've scribed or just between. So those are the first things I'm going to do. Next, I want to take my dividers and set them to 1mm wider than my stones, and my stones are 3mm, so I'm going to go ahead and set my dividers for 4mm using my millimeter side of my ruler. And then I'm going to take the end that's completely set or completely flat, and I'm going to mark my first space. And since I'm only going to set 3 stones, I'll mark the second space. And the third space. Actually, I'm going to do 4 spaces because this bottom part I'm not going to set the stone into. So I've got my 3 areas for my stone marked off, and now what I want to do is mark the center point where I'm going to be doing my drilling. So I'm going to set my dividers to 1.5mm, or roughly thereabouts. I'm going to go from the line that I scribed horizontally and mark the center of the first section. I'm going to do the same thing with the second one, and then the same thing for the last one. Now what I want to do with those those marks is create a divot so that my drill bit doesn't skip around in them. So I'm going to use a center punch and a small hammer and mark the centers. And that's the start. And I've marked my centers right on the center line so that I can set the stones exactly in the center, because what's going to happen is I've got a 4mm or 3.5mm width, and it's okay for the stone to set outside just a little bit, but what I'm going to do is drill directly down in the center so my stone is actually centered in the work. Now the one thing I didn't mention you will also need is drills. You're going to need that to cut the holes. So I'm going to start off with a 20 gauge drill and drill my center holes. I'm going to use a little bit of burr lube because that helps my drills stay sharp longer. Ooh, I broke my drill. Darn it, my drill broke inside. Well, I'm gonna have to cut this off and start over. And the reason that happened is because I was pressing down too hard on my drill. So it was putting too much pressure and it broke. So let's cut off this piece here since I can't use it. And since I have lines all the way up, now all I have to do is reset my width lines. So let's go back and set this at 4 millimeters. I'll mark my horizontal lines. And repunch my centers. Well, I gotta measure the centers first, so let's put this back at 1.5 millimeters. Now I can center punch them. Okay. Let's get a new drill. Try this again. Go slowly and take your time. You don't want to break your drill bit like I did. Okay, there we go. You're also going to need a cylinder burr and a ball burr that's approximately 3 millimeters in diameter. So I'm going to measure this just to make sure I've got the right burr. And this one's at 2. And this one's at 2.9, which is roughly 3, pretty close to 3. And I'm going to open the seats from the drill. But before I do that, I'm going to drill those holes a little bit bigger because what you want is holes that are roughly half the diameter of your stone. So in this case, I've got 3 millimeter stones and I want my holes to be roughly 1.5 millimeters in diameter so that when I use the ball burr, it'll cut correctly. Oh, nothing is working for me today. Try this again. Okay. Sometimes it works for you, sometimes it doesn't. So now I'm going to take the 3 millimeter ball burr and open the seats just like I would for a flush setting, because really this pave setting is a flush setting with prongs. Get some burr lube. And you want to go into the metal to the thickest part of your ball burr, or the widest part of your ball burr, and that should be roughly the same diameter of the stone or maybe a little bit smaller. In this case, mine are going to be a little bit smaller because my burr is a little bit smaller. Take your time with this too, so you know that they're centered. And I recommend drilling everything and not doing the drill and setting a stone and then drill and setting a stone and then drill and setting a stone, because you don't want your stones to break in between. Okay, ooh, that got a little bit hot. Okay, so I have my seats. One other thing I'm going to do is on the rear side, I'm going to chamfer the bottom so that it's neater looking. I don't want any rough edges or rough burrs. There we go. Looks good. Let's flip this back around. Now the next thing to do is to make the channels in between the stones so that they can fit in there and allow as much light as possible. And normally I would do this with a hand graver, but not everybody's got a hand graver, so that's why I chose this half-millimeter cone, or I'm sorry, half-millimeter cylinder burr, so that I can remove the excess material in between my stones. And I'll do that on the bottom and the two middle areas, and then finally the top. It's a little bit awkward, but once you get it practiced, you'll be able to do it a lot easier. Now, the one thing with burring out this section, you only want to burr till half the thickness of the metal, because you want to give the stone as much light as possible. Ooh. In this case, half the thickness of my metal is basically the thickness of my cylinder burr. Keep checking the sides to make sure that you've got it deep enough. Okay, so I've got my 3 holes drilled, the seats are open, and then I have the channels in between each one of the stone settings to open it up for light. The next thing we're going to do is take a larger cylinder burr and cut open the sides on both sides, and then we're also going to cut the center here so that we have channels to set the stone that are open faced and you have more light. I'm going to replace my smaller burr with a larger burr because it will be taking away more metal. Go slowly with this as well, because you don't want to take out too much material. You want to be able to leave some prong material. Ooh. And same as before, you want to cut in half the thickness of the metal. So check both sides just to make sure that's how far down you've gone. Get a little bit burr lube here. With the cylinder burr, it's easier because you can actually cut both sides at the same time and get an even depth and an even amount of prongs. So that's halfway. This one needs to go a little bit deeper. There we go. Now I've got a lot of prong material here, so I'm going to remove a little bit more. You don't want too much prong material. Do this slowly, take your time, do it in multiple steps. Oops. Don't like it when it does that. Okay, so now I have my channels in between the stones. And then I also have my channels on the side edges or the side walls where I'm going to be setting my stones. The next thing to do is to remove the middle material here. And that's a little tricky because getting your cone burr in place is a little bit more difficult than on the sides because you can lay it flat like that. And in this case, we're going to have to go in it at an angle. Let me pull my light over here a little bit better. There we go. And you're going to remove about the same amount of material that you did on the sides. You want to go about halfway down. And we're going to do one side at a time. Watching for the prong material. Be very careful with this because you don't want to remove your prongs by accident. You need something to set the stones in. So that's one direction. Now I'm going to turn around and go this direction to remove the excess material on this side. And like I said, most jewelers would use a graver to do this, but I wanted to show you how to do this without using engraving tools. This last one's a bit tricky because I've got my line in there. Oops. Be really careful with that because you can rip off your prongs really easily. So I'm going to go back to this one and get the center off of the last part of this setting. Sometimes you might have to go over it a couple of times, but that's okay. You want to clean up the settings anyway. Try not to go too fast with your Flexshaft, otherwise it'll skip just like it keeps doing for me. Okay, I'm gonna put my Cylinder Bur, the smaller one, back in my Flexshaft and clean up these center areas where my prongs are split. Actually, I grabbed my drill instead of my prongs. So if you don't have a Cylinder Bur, you can use a drill. A drill bit will work just as well. Cylinder Bur has a little bit more control, so that's why I use the Cylinder Bur. Oops. Okay, so now you have the basic setting open. I'm going to take a ball burr that's a little bit smaller than my 3mm and open up the seats just a little bit more before I start to use the ball burr, the right size ball burr again to open my seats. Double check my chamfers on the outside. Okay. So now I've got the setting section almost complete. I need to open the seats a little bit more with my ball burr, and then I'm going to switch to a Hart Bur to make the seats have a click. Now I still need to test my stones to make sure that my settings will fit my stones. So I'm going to take one of my stones out and check it. I'm using calibrated Cubic Zirconias, so it's a little bit easier. I know I don't have to measure each and every one of them to see if they fit, because I know they're 3mm in diameter. And right now, they're setting right on top of the prongs where I want them to be. So the next step is to find my Hart Bur that is 3mm in diameter or closer. You want to make sure that it's either less than 3mm or right at 3mm. And this one is right at 3mm, so I'm going to use this one to open my seats to the final size. I'm going to test the fit of my stone again, and this time it should pop in place. Perfect. It's set in place just right. So now I can take my beading tool and push the prongs over the top of each one of these stones. But I'm going to go ahead and check all 3 of the settings to make sure that they fit. I'm going to use my brass pusher here to try and pop this one into place. That one went in perfectly. The second hole was just a little bit too shallow. I keep checking the sides to make sure that my stones are even, so that one's not any deeper than the next one, because you don't want your stones set up and down like that. You want them to set flat. Oh, I pushed a little bit too hard. That's okay. I'm going to set them one at a time so you get the idea. Now, this setting that I've made are individual prong settings, so there's 4 prongs for each stone. They also have what they call a shared setting, where you have 1 prong in between each one of the stones, or I should say 2 prongs instead of 4 in between the stones, and that's what they call a shared prong. One thing I'm noticing here is that I need to take a little bit of more material out from between the stones. So I'm going to take my burr again and remove a little bit more. And I'm going to use the larger burr. I want my prongs to be a little smaller, so that they're easier to push over. There we go. That's better. So I need to get my beading tools. Sorry, I didn't have that ready. So the trick with the beading tools is to find one that is the same, roughly the same diameter as your prongs, so that when you press them over, you've got a nice rounded edge. So this is a beading tool. And basically what it is a concave burr or concave pusher. Instead of a pusher that would be like for bezel pushing, this is a prong pushing. And I'm gonna check the size over my prongs, and this one's just a little bit too big, so I need to go down a little smaller. That one's too small, so the next one should be just right. Yep, this one's just right. So I'm going to put it in the handle. And another trick is to use a little bit of wax to hold your stone in place. I don't have any wax on my bench at the moment, so I'm going to do my best to set these without them moving around without the wax. Now, if you have a microscope, this is a heck of a lot easier to see the prongs and to get the settings in place, but it's hard for me to film under a microscope, so I'm not going to use that. Now, I need to use my beading tool and press the prongs over the stone. So what I'm doing is I'm pushing forward and I am rotating around so I get a nice rounded prong. Oop. It's kind of hard to hold this without a holding tool. So if you've got any Thermolock or shellac to hold it in place, I recommend using that to hold your work in place. And you want to do this in larger circles, and you keep doing it until you get the stone set in place. And if your prongs are too wide, you might have to, which mine are, well, maybe not. Yeah, they are. I need to cut a little bit deeper with my burr, so I'm gonna go back to the smaller burr and cut a little deeper. Now, this takes some practice, and it's been a little while since I've done it, but that's still not an excuse. I just need to practice it a little bit more so I can get a little more control of my burr. I'm checking the edges to make sure that my burr is cutting the same depth. And you do opposite ends. Darn it. As you can see, this is so tiny, even with a 3mm burr, sometimes it's difficult to manage everything. So you have to take your time. Get your stone in there right too. There we go. Not sure if you heard the tiny little click, but there was one. Well, darn it. That one just does not want to stay in there. I think it's because it's pushing out every time I... Okay, well, I must have cut that one a little bit too big, so let's try the second one. Like I said, this takes a lot of practice, and I can't always get it perfect the first time, and sometimes I have to cut several different tries. So be patient with yourself. As you can see, I'm a fairly experienced stone setter, and I'm having a little bit difficulty here, but you get the idea, the steps that you need to set the stones. And with silver, you have to press pretty hard in order for the stone or the prong to move over, so it could just be that I'm not pressing hard enough on that first one. There we go. You can hear it click in place, so you know the stone is setting in there. It's just, I think my material may not be deep enough for this stone. I needed it to be a little bit deeper. Oh. Darn it, I bent it. So I bent it, but you can see the stone is set now. That just means I cut a little bit too thin on here, and that happens sometimes. But now you can see I've got the center stone set. It's holding in place. You basically press the 4 beads over the top, and you will have what they call a bead set pave. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and if so, please give me a like. And if you have questions, leave them down below in the comment section, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week. Bye.